Good evening. Settle in, close your eyes, and let me introduce you to Gilded Age Samuel Ward McAllister, a man who wasn't born rich, but made the elite believe he belonged. He once blew his entire inheritance, $1,000, on a single outfit in a single night. To put that in perspective, that's the modern equivalent of about $35,000 gone on a suit. Now be honest, would you blow your whole inheritance in a suit? Most of us would, at best, spring for something sensible from Macy's, maybe a car, maybe a semester of college. Ward bet it all on fantasy rather than reality. And here's the thing, it worked. That gamble landed him in New York's most exclusive salon, where he became the gatekeeper to the Gilded Age's most coveted guest lists. For decades, he thrived on power, spectacle, and the delicious cruelty of exclusion. But the higher you climb, the harder the fall. His empire of etiquette would collapse in scandal and laughter, leaving Ward, once the autocrat of the drawing room, to die in debt and obscurity, his legacy mocked in the same newspapers that once hung on his every word. Tonight, we'll follow the strange, glittering rise and fall of Ward McAllister, the man who conned his way into the ballroom, crowned himself its ruler, and discovered that society is loyal only until the champagne runs out. Samuel Ward McAllister entered the world in 1827 in Savannah, Georgia, and it is fair to say that destiny did not exactly place a silver spoon in his crib. He was not born into robber baron fortunes or the dynasties of Dutch Knickerbockers. His father, Matthew, was a lawyer and judge, respectable certainly, but not the kind of name that would get you automatic entry into the marble palaces of Fifth Avenue. Savannah was a genteel city of cotton wealth, where plantation owners sipped sweet tea on verandas, while enslaved laborers did the actual work. It was a society built on manners as much as money, and young Ward absorbed both with a hawk's attention. He was a slight boy with sharp features, always observing, always calculating. While other children wrestled in the yard, Ward was the one memorizing how his mother orchestrated a dinner party, the order of conversation, the subtle cues, the way she smiled at the right moment to make a dull story sound interesting. From her, Ward learned that social navigation was a kind of warfare, just with better outfit. He saw that a well-timed glance could silence a room more effectively than a musket. His mother became his first teacher, and though he wouldn't inherit her beauty, he certainly inherited her tactical precision. Savannah, though, was too small a stage for Ward's ambitions. He was a fish with dreams bigger than the pond, and he was already imagining himself in the salons of New York, or even Europe, where dukes and duchesses floated across parquet floors like chess pieces in motion. He dutifully studied law at Yale, because what else does a Southern gentleman do when ambition hasn't yet found its costume? But dusty tomes of precedent never thrilled him. Courtrooms smelled of paper and sweat. What thrilled him was people, how they moved, how they dressed, how they revealed their insecurities in tiny gestures. He realized his true gift wasn't in passing contracts, it was in passing human behavior. So when his modest inheritance came due, Ward wasn't interested in investing in land, or in starting a practice, or in marrying some well-connected heiress in Savannah. No, he spent it all, and spectacularly. Imagine yourself inheriting $1,000 in the 1850s. That's roughly $35,000 today. A year's tuition, a decent car, maybe a house deposit if you shop carefully. What did Ward do with his? He blew it in a single night buying one single outfit. Tailcoat, waistcoat, silk cravat, gloves, cane, the works. Not just clothing, but armor. He wasn't dressing for the life he had. He was dressing for the life he intended to bluff his way into. Would you blow your entire inheritance on a suit? Most of us would at least buy something durable, but Ward was betting on fantasy, and to his credit, it was the best investment he ever made. That outfit was his entrance fee to the performance of a lifetime. After his Savannah apprenticeship in manners, and a brief stint at the family law practice, Ward set sail for Europe, and if Savannah had been too small, Europe was exactly the scale he craved. Here were dukes, marquises, counts, and barons, real ones, with titles stretching back centuries. Here were palaces where chandeliers the size of oak trees glowed over tables heavy with crystal. Here was aristocracy in its full absurdity. Ward didn't have the money, but he had the eyes of an anthropologist. He watched how the French courts bowed, how the Italians kissed hands, how the English treated dinner seating like a blood sport. He absorbed it all like a sponge dipped in champagne. For Ward, Europe wasn't just a holiday, it was a finishing school. He saw how society wasn't just about wealth, it was about exclusivity, spectacle, and above all, control. If a French duke could dictate the order of conversation at a ball, why couldn't Ward someday do the same in New York? When he returned to America, He had no fortune, no title, and no claim to greatness. But he did have a vision: to graft the rituals of European courts onto the chaotic, brash, booming world of Gilded Age New York. He wouldn't build railroads. He wouldn't drill oil. His empire would be etiquette. His battlefield would be the ballroom. And his weapons? Charm, spectacle, and exclusion. New York in the 1850s was a city of extreme. Wall Street minted millionaires overnight, while tenement families crammed into rooms the size of closets. The Knickerbockers, descendants of old Dutch settlers, clung to their faded pedigree, sneering at the new millionaires who plastered their mansions with gilt like frosting. Into this battlefield stepped Ward McAllister, with no pedigree and no money, armed only with his charm and his finely tailored suit. The old families dismissed him as a provincial southerner. The nouveau riches thought him a snob. But Ward had a gift. He could make anyone feel important, temporarily. He started small, hosting modest dinners, sprinkling compliments like fairy dust, remembering names, tracking every quirk and faux pas. His law practice quietly slipped into irrelevance. His true job was people. His breakthrough came when he befriended the Astors. Caroline Astor's fortune was old enough to command respect, but she was hungry for polish, for a social blueprint that matched her wealth. Ward stepped in as her tutor. He taught her how to host dinners that could outshine European aristocrats, how to manage introductions so no one felt slighted, and how to curtsy without looking like a startled chicken. In return, the Astors opened their doors to him. And once Ward had a toe inside, he never left. He transformed himself from guest to gatekeeper. His dinners became legendary, not for food, though terrapin soup became his signature, but for the guest lists. He began curating people like an art collector. If you were invited, you owed him. If you weren't, you might as well not exist. Ward had transformed social status into a currency, and he was its banker. The irony, of course, was that he was often broke himself, living on loans, and the generosity of those he flattered. But nobody knew. He wore his charm like a cloak, concealing the debts behind a velvet smile. Ward had learned the lesson that would define his career. Exclusivity is more powerful than wealth. Anyone could build a mansion, but only Ward could decide if you mattered enough to be seen in it. In the middle of the Gilded Age, a time when millionaires were sprouting like weeds and the smell of fresh plaster from new Fifth Avenue mansions filled the air, Ward McAllister made his boldest move yet. He decided to invent his own kind of royalty. And his coronation would take place, not in a cathedral, but in Delmonico's restaurant. Yes, Delmonico. The fanciest dining establishment in New York, with velvet chairs, crystal chandeliers, and waiters who could balance more terrapin soup tureens than you've had hot dinners. Ward christened his creation the Patriarch's Ball. The name alone carried a whiff of grandeur, as if Moses himself had drawn up the guest list. Here was the genius. 25 patriarchs, each allowed to invite 9 people. Simple arithmetic gave you exactly 400 guests. Ward was quietly laying the foundation for the infamous number that would haunt New York society, the 400. But in the 1870s, nobody realized what he was doing. They just knew the Patriarch's balls were the hottest tickets in town. To be invited was to be seen. To not be invited was to sit at home pretending you didn't care, while secretly gnawing your knuckles over the gossip column. The events themselves were dazzling. Picture it: chandeliers dripping with light, diamonds glittering like a second set of stars, gowns so wide you needed a permit to turn around in them. The music swelled, champagne flowed, and Ward glided through it all with the air of a general reviewing his troops. Except instead of soldiers, he commanded a battalion of overdressed millionaires desperate for approval. The newspapers lapped it up. They reported not just who danced with whom, but who stumbled, who wore the wrong shade of mauve, who had mysteriously not been seen at all. The Patriarch's balls turned society into a spectator sport, and Ward, he was both referee and coach, deciding the rules as he went along. This was the essence of the Gilded Age, creating exclusivity out of thin air, selling people a dream of belonging. Anyone could build a mansion, and they did, complete with ballrooms dripping in gilt and ceilings painted like Renaissance chapel, but only Ward could anoint you in. Of course, this also made him plenty of enemies. The nouveau riches, the Vanderbilt, the Goulds, the Astor's less illustrious cousins bristled at being excluded. The old Knickerbockers grumbled that Ward was just a glorified maître d' with a southern accent. But as long as people craved his invitations, Ward remained untouchable. And if you think your office holiday party is stressful now, imagine Ward's balls. One wrong seating arrangement could start a family feud. Serving the wrong soup could spark whispers in the press. Forget mispronouncing someone's name. Do that in Ward's world, and you'd be socially exiled faster than you could say Delmonico's terrapin. The patriarch's balls weren't just dances, they were declarations of power. And Ward McAllister, the man who once blew his entire inheritance on a suit, had turned himself into the kingmaker of the Gilded Age. If Ward was the architect, then Caroline Astor was the cathedral. She was the Mrs. Astor, the one woman in New York so powerful that no first name was needed. In the Gilded Age, when robber barons built railroads and fortunes by day, it was Mrs. Astor who decided which of their wives could sit at her dinner table by night. Ward knew he couldn't rule society alone. He had the rules, the wit, the gossip, and the shamelessness, but he needed a queen to enforce his decrees. Enter Mrs. Astor. She had the mansion, the pedigree, the ballroom that could fit exactly 400, and most importantly, she had the authority to sneer without even raising her voice. Together, they became the oddest power couple of the Gilded Age. Not romantically, Mrs. Astor would sooner have eloped with a footman, but socially, they were inseparable. Ward was the strategist, the one with the notebook filled with observations, too loud, too nouveau, hair too red. Mrs. Astor was the enforcer, the one who could freeze a woman out of society with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. Ward gave her structure. She gave him legitimacy. He turned her dinners into orchestrated performances, where no one sat by accident, no conversation happened unplanned. Imagine a dinner party where even the soup course had political implications. That was a McAllister Astor production. It was also a peculiar kind of theatre. Behind the lace curtains, Ward was usually broke. His own lifestyle was held together by loans and flattery, his dinners often funded by others who feared falling off his list. But when he swept into Mrs. Astor's ballroom, you'd never know. He glowed with authority, barking quiet instructions to servants, arranging introductions like a stage director, placing actors on their marks. The newspapers started calling him the autocrat of the drawing room, and in truth, that's what he was, an unelected dictator of manners. The irony is delicious. America had spent a century fighting to escape aristocracy, and here was Ward, a Southern lawyer turned social climber, happily rebuilding it in the middle of Manhattan. By the late 1880s, Ward decided to put a number on it. Not a lot, not some, but exactly 400. When asked how many people truly mattered in New York society, Ward announced, 400, no more, no less. Why 400? Because that was how many Mrs. Astor's ballroom could fit. The math was that simple. One woman's floor plan became the definition of American aristocracy, and with that, the legend of the 400 was born. The press went wild. The newspapers published lists of who was in, who wasn't, who deserved to be, and who was probably weeping into their oyster forks at home. Families that didn't make the cut staged their own rival parties, larger, louder, gaudier, but everyone knew they were just consolation prizes. It was the ultimate Gilded Age stunt. Turn air into exclusivity, and exclusivity into power. Ward had no money of his own, but he made millionaires grovel for his approval. A single nod from him could launch a family into society. A single snub could exile them to eternal obscurity in Staten Island. The fallout was deliciously absurd. One furious socialite supposedly threw a vase at her husband after realizing they weren't on the list. Another demanded her jeweler add 400 into a bracelet, just to prove she belonged. It was the 19th century version of fighting to get on the Met Gala guest list, only with more pearls and fewer Kardashians. Ward basked in the attention. His creation wasn't just a list, it was immortality. He'd codified the Gilded Age's obsession with exclusivity into a single number, and for a while, it worked. He was the arbiter, the referee, the man who decided who mattered. But here's the catch. The higher the pedestal, the more people waiting to knock you off. Every excluded Vanderbilt, every insulted millionaire, every ambitious upstart now had Ward in their sights. He was an autocrat, yes, but he was also the lightning rod. And in the Gilded Age, where egos were as fragile as champagne glasses, that was a dangerous place to be. For all his strutting through ballrooms and scribbling names into little black books, Ward McAllister did have a home life, and it was, in many ways, as carefully stage-managed as his social persona, though perhaps with fewer chandeliers and more unpaid bills. Ward married Sarah Tainter Gibbons in 1853, a woman from a wealthy Connecticut family. And here's the crucial part. She actually had money, serious money. Without Sarah, Ward's dreams of ballrooms and terrapin soup might have remained daydreams scribbled on Savannah stationery. She brought him a fortune big enough to bankroll the kind of lifestyle he wanted, and he brought her, well, ambition, energy, and a relentless determination to make her money work overtime in the social arena. It wasn't the kind of love story you write poetry, more like a mutually beneficial business merger, sealed with vows. But Ward, for all his vanity, was said to be devoted to Sarah in his way. He called her Sally, and leaned heavily on her fortune and patience whenever his own finances came up short, which was often. The couple had children, though Ward rarely let fatherhood get in the way of his late nights at Delmonico. Accounts suggest he was affectionate, but distracted, more likely to recall who sat next to whom at dinner than the details of his son's lessons. In classic Gilded Age style, much of the actual parenting fell to governesses, while Ward devoted himself to perfecting the finer points of soup serving. At home, Ward played the gentleman, but could not entirely hide his flaws. He had a notorious sweet tooth, an unshakable love of rich food, and a tendency to overindulge in wine. He was also a terrible money man. Despite Sally's wealth, the McAllister finances were forever teetering on the edge of embarrassment. Ward had a knack for spending $3 for every two he earned, usually on clothes, parties, or dinners, designed to impress someone richer. His Newport summers were particularly telling. The McAllisters rented houses near the truly grand mansions, never quite on the same scale. Ward would sweep into the beach clubs in immaculate attire, but behind closed doors, he was forever juggling unpaid tailor's bills and overdue servants' wages. Think of it as the 19th century version of maxing out 3 credit cards to keep up with your influencer lifestyle. And yet, for all his posturing, Ward was genuinely charming in smaller settings. Friends recalled that he could tell a story with perfect timing, that he laughed easily, and that he enjoyed making others feel like they were part of something important. He was, in essence, an early practitioner of the fake it till you make it philosophy. Only in Ward's case, he faked it so hard and so consistently that most people forgot he hadn't actually made it. His personal correspondence adds another layer. Ward wrote long, florid letters about etiquette, dinners, and social maneuverings, often in the tone of a man convinced he was writing history. He dropped names shamelessly, not unlike today's LinkedIn power users who can't resist reminding you who they had coffee with last week. In every letter, every anecdote, every little household anecdote, he was rehearsing his legend. But perhaps the most striking thing about Ward at home was his insecurity. Beneath the swagger, he was acutely aware of his precarious position. He wasn't a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller. He wasn't old Knickerbocker stock. He was a Savannah transplant, perpetually borrowing other people's grandeur, and Sally's fortune, while comfortable, was not bottomless. He knew that his empire of invitations and seating charts rested on very fragile foundations. Still, Ward performed. Day after day, ball after ball, dinner after dinner, he put on the show. At home he might have been fretting over unpaid debts, but in the ballroom he was the arbiter, the autocrat, the peacock in full display. And in a way, that duality was the most Gilded Age thing about him. The Gilded Age itself was all surface glitter with plenty of rot underneath. Ward embodied that perfectly, dazzling on the outside, unstable behind the curtain. So while the world saw the autocrat of the drawing room, at home, he was more like a frantic accountant in evening gloves, trying desperately to keep the illusion alive. It was a performance he could maintain for years. But, as we'll soon see, every performance has an audience, and eventually that audience turned. If Ward McAllister was the self-proclaimed king of New York society, then Alva Vanderbilt was the rebel queen who stormed the palace gates with a battering ram made of solid gold. The Vanderbilts were the definition of nouveau riche. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt had built a shipping and railroad empire, but his manners were, let's say, more tugboat than ballroom. His children inherited not only the fortune, but also the stigma. Old Knickerbocker families sniffed that the Vanderbilts were little more than flashy interlopers with cash registers where their family trees should be. And Ward, ever the defender of refined society, delighted in keeping them at arm's length. He called them vulgar. He told Mrs. Astor they were unsuited for her ballroom. He scribbled snide little notes about their tasteless gowns and their obsession with displaying wealth. To Ward, the Vanderbilts were the cautionary tale of the Gilded Age. Money without manners, fortune without finesse. Enter Alva Vanderbilt, petite, intense, and armed with the kind of determination that could move mountains, or at least redecorate them in French Rococo style. Alva wasn't just rich, she was ambitious. She didn't want her family's fortune to buy her just houses and diamonds. She wanted respect, power and position, and she had no intention of letting some savannah-born social climber block her way. Ward underestimated. That was his first mistake. The showdown came in 1883, when Alva unveiled her masterstroke, the Vanderbilt costume ball. Think of it as the Met Gala of the Gilded Age, except with more ostrich feathers, diamonds sewn into bodices, and a guest list so long it could have filled 2 Astor ballrooms. Over around 200 invitations went out, triple the size of Ward's precious 400. Guests spent fortunes on elaborate costumes, Venetian courtiers, medieval queens, even one poor man dressed as a ship, complete with sails. Newspapers described it breathlessly, column after column, while society matrons gasped over every ridiculous detail. It was excess on a scale that made even Delmonico's chandeliers look humble. And Ward? He was cornered. For years he had kept the Vanderbilts out, telling Mrs. Astor they were unworthy. But suddenly, everyone wanted an invitation to Alva's ball. To make matters worse, Mrs. Astor's own daughter was desperate to attend. Social rivalry is one thing, but when your child insists she must go, even Mrs. Astor had to bend. So Caroline Astor, the Iron Queen of Fifth Avenue, paid Alva a call. She left her card at the Vanderbilt mansion, the formal gesture of recognition she had withheld for years. It was an unspoken admission. The Vanderbilts were in. Ward had lost. His exclusivity type of game had been blown apart by sheer scale and spectacle. Alva had done what money does best in the Gilded Age: bulldoze tradition and replace it with something bigger, shinier, louder. The Vanderbilt costume ball was a triumph for Alva and a humiliation for Ward. He could pretend otherwise, of course, strutting through his own smaller dinners with the air of command, but everyone knew the truth. He was no longer the sole gatekeeper. The velvet rope had been stretched and torn. It was a turning point, not just for Ward, but for the whole Gilded Age. Old money and new money were no longer separated by an invisible wall. They were colliding on dance floors, wrapped in diamonds and tulle, drinking champagne out of goblets shaped like swans. And Ward McAllister, once the autocrat of the drawing room, was beginning to look more like the cranky usher at the theatre, grumbling as everyone else rushed past. Ward could have stopped there. He could have gracefully retreated, enjoyed his dinners, spent his declining years quietly sipping soup and reminiscing about the good old days when a man could exile a Vanderbilt with a raised eyebrow. But Ward never knew when to quit. In 1890, he published Society as I Have Found It. Now the title alone tells you everything. It wasn't Society as it is, or Society as you might enjoy it, but Society as I Have Found It. As if the world had been waiting with bated breath to read his personal diary of who wore what and how soup should be ladled. The book was supposed to be his magnum opus, the codification of his rules, his legacy carved in paper and ink. He envisioned it as half etiquette manual, half social history, the story of how he, Ward McAllister, had defined the Gilded Age's glittering society. What it actually was, well, imagine your least favorite coworker writing a 500-page memoir full of name-dropping, recipes, and smug anecdotes about who once complimented their terrapin soup. That was Ward's book. He described dinners in excruciating detail, explained how to properly serve asparagus, and bragged endlessly about his proximity to the Astors. He even included recipes, as though future historians would desperately need to know how much salt belonged in his consommé. The press tore it apart. Newspapers mocked it as self-indulgent, pompous, a monument to vanity. Cartoonists sketched him ladling soup over people's heads. Critics rolled their eyes at his obsession with name-dropping. Whole chapters were just lists of who sat where, written with the enthusiasm of a man convinced that seating charts were the key to civilization. Even Mrs. Astor, his once ironclad ally, distanced herself. She never publicly criticized him, but her silence was deafening. Friends who once tolerated his pomposity now laughed behind his back. Younger socialites dismissed him as hopelessly outdated, a relic who didn't understand that the Gilded Age was already changing. Ward had mistaken his role. He thought of himself as the author of society, the one shaping the story. In reality, he had been a supporting character, clever, influential, yes, but not the hero. And once he put pen to paper, the illusion shattered. It's a mistake we still see today. The influencer who thinks they've built an empire, only to publish a memoir nobody asked for, only to discover that without the audience's fascination, they're just another person yelling into the void. Ward's book was his Instagram overshare, his ill-advised TED talk, and it cost him dearly. The man who had once controlled access to the ballroom was suddenly a punchline. He had given his enemies the ammunition they'd been waiting for. Worse, he had shown the cracks in his own armor, the vanity, the pettiness, the desperate need for recognition. The autocrat of the drawing room had published his own downfall, one asparagus tip at a time. By the early 1890s, the Gilded Age was in full swing. Mansions sprawled like marble fortresses up Fifth Avenue. Newport's summer cottages looked more like Versailles with shingles. Diamonds weren't just worn, they were practically stapled to gowns. If you had money, you flaunted it, and if you didn't have money, you pretended you did. For Ward McAllister, this should have been paradise. But instead, his empire was starting to look like an overcooked soufflé, still puffy on the outside, but collapsing fast if you poked it with a spoon. The first crack came with the panic of 1893, a financial crisis that rattled the entire country. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Even the grandest families suddenly found themselves scrambling. And Ward, who was never exactly good with money to begin with, suffered doubly. He had always relied on Sally's fortune and the occasional generosity of friends, but now those friends were tightening purse strings. He was still expected to host, to dine, to strut, but fewer people were willing to cover the bill. Debt piled up. Ward pawned heirlooms, borrowed shamelessly, and kept up appearances with the desperation of a man applying a second layer of powder over a crack in the wall. To the public eye, he was still the autocrat of society. Privately, he was living off fumes. Then came the mistakes. For decades, Ward had been meticulous, a master of detail. He knew who belonged where, who couldn't sit next to whom, who should never be seen in the same room. But now, whether from fatigue, age, or sheer carelessness, he began to slip. Names were misremembered, seating charts botched. An enemy would mysteriously end up with a prime place at dinner, while a supposed ally sulked at the far end of the table. People noticed. And in New York high society, noticing is blood sport. The gossip columns, once so eager to sing his praises, started poking. One column joked that Ward was better at seating asparagus than another hinted that his endless rules about dinner etiquette were sounding more like nagging than refinement. And the younger generation, they had no patience for him. To them, Ward's rules felt fussy, outdated, a relic of their parents' world. The Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, the Morgans, they were throwing parties that didn't bother with Ward's intricate seating diagram. They wanted scale, spectacle, drama. Alva Vanderbilt was staging operas in her ballroom. Newport houses were throwing masquerades that made Ward's patriarch's balls look like modest luncheons. Ward was suddenly the old man in the corner, lecturing about soup spoons while the kids invented new games. He still had the title of autocrat, but the throne was wobbling. His once prized authority was beginning to look like stubbornness. And beneath it all, his health was failing. Years of rich food, wine and stress had left him with gout, tremors, and exhaustion. He limped through events, trying to hide his discomfort behind a well-practiced smile. But the cracks were showing. The man who once strode like a general through Delmonico's now shuffled more like a weary clerk. In short, Ward McAllister, the man who once defined the glitter of the Gilded Age, was becoming a punchline in the very world he had created, and the fall was only just beginning. The final years of Ward McAllister's reign were less a graceful exit and more a slow-motion collapse, complete with public laughter, private debts, and humiliations that made his enemies positively giddy. Newport, once his summer playground, became the stage for his decline. The Vanderbilt palaces at Marble House and the Breakers were redefining excess. Alva Vanderbilt threw entertainment so spectacular that newspapers ran multiple pages of coverage. Compared to these extravaganzas, Ward's carefully curated dinners looked quaint, like bringing a cheese platter to a fireworks show. Desperate to reclaim his relevance, Ward attempted a comeback ball in 1895. He intended it to remind everyone that he was still the gatekeeper, still the autocrat of the drawing room. Instead, the press mocked it mercilessly. The guest list fell short of his magic number. Only about 300 showed up, and the papers dubbed it McAllister's 300, a cruel echo of the glory days of the 400. It was the equivalent of posting a selfie and watching the likes trickle in at a fraction of what you used to get. And then came the humiliations. At one dinner, a young socialite, emboldened by champagne and the shifting tides, openly mocked Ward to his face, imitating his pompous mannerisms while the room laughed. Once upon a time, such insolence would have ended a career. Now it just ended Ward's dignity. Even Caroline Astor, his lifelong ally, began to withdraw. She never publicly denounced him, That wasn't her style, but her absence was damning. Without Mrs. Astor's support, Ward was just a Savannah lawyer in fancy clothes, and society knew it. He tried to pivot, giving lectures on etiquette, hoping to rebrand himself as a wise elder statesman of manners. But nobody wanted to pay for a man they now considered a relic. His talks drew small crowds, polite applause, and little else. Ward was yesterday's news. A cautionary tale with gout. Financial ruin followed. His debts mounted, his possessions trickled into pawnshops, and his letters grew increasingly desperate. The man who once decided who belonged in the ballroom was now begging for loans to cover household expenses. His private life mirrored his public one. Everything was about appearances, and everything was falling apart. The irony could not have been sharper. Ward McAllister had spent decades building an empire of etiquette, dictating who mattered and who didn't. And now, in his twilight, the world had decided he didn't. He was still alive, but socially, he had already been pronounced dead. In January 1896, the final curtain was about to fall, and this time, there would be no terrapin soup, no chandeliers, no 400 waiting breathlessly for his approval, just silence. By the winter of 1896, Ward McAllister was a broken man. His health was shot, his debts piled high, and the once bright chandeliers of New York society had dimmed for him long ago. The man who once dictated the guest list for the entire Gilded Age couldn't even guarantee a full table at dinner anymore. He died on January 31st, 1896, at the age of 68, after what the papers politely described as an illness of exhaustion. Exhaustion was one way to put it. Years of chasing status, hosting endless dinners, overindulging in rich food, and juggling more enemies than friends had finally caught up to him. And how did New York society, the world he had shaped and ruled for decades, react? With a shrug. His funeral was sparsely attended. Mrs. Astor, his partner in social engineering, sent flowers but didn't show up. The same families who once begged for his approval now found themselves mysteriously busy. The newspapers gave him a few inches, sandwiched between Vanderbilt scandals and financial news. The man who once filled entire columns with chatter about asparagus forks had become a footnote. It was a fittingly cruel end. The autocrat of the drawing room died not with the sound of music and laughter, but with the silence of irrelevance. Ward had always believed society would crumble without him. Instead, it carried on just fine, thank you very much. Balls were still thrown, gowns still glittered, fortunes still flaunted. The only difference was that nobody asked Ward McAllister's opinion, and his family retreated quietly. They had little interest in maintaining his illusion of grandeur. To them, Ward was less a legend and more a cautionary tale about vanity, overspending, and the dangers of believing your own press clipping. And yet, for all the mockery, all the downfall, all the forgotten funerals, Ward McAllister left behind something bigger than himself. He left behind the 400. The number stuck. Long after Ward was gone, people still used it as shorthand for exclusivity. Even as the Gilded Age itself gave way to the Jazz Age, the 400 remained in the cultural vocabulary, a symbol of who mattered, who didn't. Think about it. Ward McAllister was essentially the first influence. He created scarcity, sold access, and convinced people that being on his list was worth more than diamonds. Today, we see it in the Forbes 400 list of billionaires, in Vanity Fair's Best Dressed, in the Met Gala guest list. Every time someone frets over whether they're on the right side of an invitation-only event, Ward's ghost is smirking in the background. His legacy is also a warning. He proved that social power built on exclusion is fragile. The moment the crowd decides they don't care about your list, you vanish. One day, you're the autocrat of the drawing room. The next, you're yesterday's news, mocked in the press, begging for loans. Ward's rise and fall is a reminder that society loves a king, but only until it's funnier to laugh at him. And perhaps that's why his story endures. The Gilded Age was full of Vanderbilts, Astors, Morgans, Rockefellers, people with money, power, and dynasties. But Ward McAllister was something else, a man who had none of that and still managed to crown himself king, if only for a while. He built an empire out of charm, soup recipes, and sheer audacity, and when it all crumbled, the glitter remained, if only as legend. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Ward McAllister, the man who conned his way into the ballroom, ruled it with a seating chart, and discovered that even the brightest chandeliers eventually burn out. The ghost of the 400 still whispers whenever we chase exclusivity, envy invitations, or wonder who's on the list.